Hey folks, welcome to the Did You Know Crypto podcast. Today we have a real treat for you. Coming back again is Jeffrey Tucker, who was last here on episode 12, and we are doing a 10 years in review where we kind of talk about all the different stuff that's going on in Bitcoin over 10 years in kind of a wider range scope, and I really think you're going to enjoy it. We touch on a lot of different subjects from politics to the scaling debate to everything that you can think of in between. It's a really fun discussion. If you could do one big favor for me, if you could go to iTunes and leave a 5-star review and a written review if possible. If you want to also help out the podcast in other ways, you can go to supportmypodcast.com. That's supportmypodcast.com, and it has links to shop on Amazon, all that kind of good stuff. But the best thing you can really do right now is to share stuff on social media and leave a review on iTunes or whatever podcast platform that you use. But most of all, I want to thank you for listening and enjoy the show. I'd like to welcome the very first repeat guest, actually, Jeffrey Tucker, Editorial Director for the American Institute for Economic Research, Chief Liberty Officer at Freedom.me, founder of the Atlanta Bitcoin Embassy, and author of countless articles and books, including his latest, called Right-Wing Collectivism, The Other Threat to Liberty. Mr. Tucker, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's so interesting you say my latest book because I'm very excited to say that I have another book coming out actually in about a month, and it's called "The Market Loves You: Why You Should Love It Back."
It's very Dr. Strangelove.
Thank you. Well, anyway, it takes a long time to come up with the title. I'm very happy with the book. It's a collection of articles, and it does have a whole section on money and discusses Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in some detail and why I think it's so significant.
No, it sounds great. I've been, eagerly awaiting your next book, and I like to. It's it has been a little while, I guess, since it has been released, but I like to plug those sorts of things, especially ones that I find to be very informative and that I enjoy. And I did want to talk about that specific topic maybe a little bit later because I think it does fit very well into our topic about Bitcoin, its future and being intertwined with our future. After our last interview, we talked about doing a 10 years in review episode, and I'm really glad that we've now seen the anniversary for the white paper, the Genesis block, and the Hal Finney Twitter announcement and growth from mere theory to, $70 billion in total market cap, and it's been an amazing ride.
Well, and we're in very strange times, like right now. And I kind of track the ethos of the industry and public culture as regards crypto. And just 2 days ago, there was a headline. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about how, it won't surprise you, Bitcoin is dead and nobody cares about it anymore. And it didn't live up to the hype, and it's just this big disaster, and everybody who got in is now broke, and so on and so on. And, I read this story, and, these tend to be bullish signs to me, actually, when these kinds of articles appear, especially in big venues like the Wall Street Journal. And I just quickly looked at the numbers and saw that Bitcoin is up 17% since its low, and I'm just talking about Bitcoin alone. But there's been all kind of activity in the markets, and I just can't sort of get groovy with this line that crypto is dead because any of us who have had this history in Bitcoin and everything remember. We all have our own memories, right? But my most salient memory is when it hit $30 and the world was screaming that it was an insane tulip mania and a bubble that was completely out of control. And so, and I didn't know if that was true or not. I don't know the right price for Bitcoin. I didn't know if it was in a bubble or if it was just beginning or what. I'm not clairvoyant. Nobody is. But I guess my point is that if you're going to say, in 2013, $30 is an absurd high price, that no magic internet money could be worth 30 times the world's most powerful fiat currency, then you can't at the same time say when Bitcoin is $4,000 that therefore it's dead. Do you see what I mean?
No, it's very much a macro, not a micro view, and probably a lot of the readers and people, in kind of the Wall Street Journal and Forbes crowd really probably weren't paying attention until October, November of 2017, and probably didn't even pay attention before it was even $4,000 in 2017. So all they saw was this rise up to 20,000, and now it's at 4,000. So obviously it's dead.
Yeah, and I don't find the current patterns, price patterns of Bitcoin to be actually all that unusual from what I've experienced in my time. And I'm not an original gangster in a sense that, like I wasn't one of these guys who saw it, hit $1 and then crash down to 3 cents or whatever, in the early days. I wasn't really part of it then. I was just on the sidelines as a skeptic, actually. But I do remember, the seesawing back and forth. It was $150, and it was $80, and it was $1,000, and it was $300, and so on and so on. And what's funny about this is it's really an experiment in human psychology, that when the momentum is going up, the screaming gets louder, people start paying attention, the buyers, the newbie buyers jump in, then they get hit when the price falls down again. Then everybody says, "See, you're losing your shirt on this bogus investment." And then when it goes up again, the people who bought low, just kind of preen around and peacock around, but then they don't sell when it gets high because they're hodlers and so on. And you just watch this drama take place, and it gets kind of boring and a little bit exhausting. And I think, if for people who are getting interested in this, right, people who have been interested for some years, you really have to ask the question, what is it about this technology that interests you? Is it just, you're buying something out there and you hope you're buying it low and you hope you're going to sell it high, or do you understand, what the implications of this technology are in terms of our relations with the state, in terms of technology for documenting ownership rights? Is it something you believe in, or is it not? And I think this is an important question that people really have to ask themselves. And then otherwise, you need to recognize that this is a technology very much in its infancy. 20 years ago, nobody even imagined such a thing as cryptocurrency. I mean, or maybe the people who imagined it couldn't figure out how to make it work. They just maybe imagined it could someday exist. But the reality of cryptocurrency is a transformative event, and it's still very much in the early stages.
It's interesting you talk about signals. I was just looking at the charts for the Bitcoin hash rate, and basically the peak of hash rate was actually in kind of mid 2018, I believe. Now we're starting to see it approach that period again. Just right before we're at levels right before the peak of 2018, and actually it's higher than it even was in 2017. And I was actually talking this morning to a gentleman named Christopher Bendixson about Bitcoin mining, and we recorded an episode on that. And one of the things we discussed is that Bitcoin sends out very clear signals. Of course, there's external factors and spillover from traditional markets, but Bitcoin's not manipulated in the same way, and it sends out very clear signals compared to the fiat-controlled markets. And I don't think that miners would be increasing hash rate and scouring the earth for cheaper energy to expand and make their operations more efficient if they think it's dead.
That's really interesting. That sounds about right. And I think that uh, these are the times that sort of challenge people. And I was around in 2017, and I went to all the conferences, and I saw all the absurdities taking place. And I must say that I've been in 2018. The conferences I've been to have been much more intellectually stimulating, productive, and robust. This is just the way new technological markets come and go. I mean, there's an ebb and flow to it, depending on mass psychology, essentially, and this is true in any big technology. I mean, like, I lived through the dot-com bust, and the boom and bust in the late '90s, and then saw the rebuilding in the early 2000s, and then gradually saw how the technology of the internet just transformed our lives and the world economy. But boy, I tell you what, in 2001, you couldn't find anybody who would say that that was possible. Everybody just saw that as like one of history's great mistakes. Internet commerce. you know so and this, and it's true also the railroads in the second half of the 19th century. You saw just these wild frenzies up and down. Railroads are great, no, railroads are terrible, oh, this is a great investment, oh, look, you lost your shirt, and so on. And the headlines are always filled with people thinking short term. And if you followed the headlines of the railroad industry between about 1860 and 1890, it was just nothing but land speculation, stock market fraud, boom and bust, crashes, disasters, and so on and so on. But then you step back from it, you realize, oh my God, the railroads transformed transportation and dramatically shrunk the world for everybody and just vastly enhanced our standard of living, just as the internet would do, 100 years later. And I think cryptocurrency has the potential to do that and more. Actually, I think the significance is actually even more salient than any technology that we've experienced in the last couple of 100 years, for very fundamental reasons.
No, I agree. If you look at any tech innovation, the history of computing, in the early days, it was IBM was the big dogs. This is a system for business. This is not something that people are going to want in their homes. And then once PC came around, and then the internet came, and there's a lot of overlap between the growth of the internet, obviously, and the PC market. But I remember hearing people say, this thing is just a fad. It's neat, but it's never going to catch on. And we all kind of remember Paul Krugman's very famous pronunciation on the fax machine that the internet would have as much impact on the economy as the fax machine. Paraphrasing, of course, but and I'm sure that I'll have this in my life at some point where I'll be set a bit in my ways, and I'll be a naysayer on some kind of new and up and coming technology. And I guess in a way we all were with Bitcoin at one point. We all didn't immediately jump on the idea of Bitcoin the first time we heard of it. So we're all kind of guilty of that as well.
We were. I mean, I certainly was. I mean, I'm embarrassed when I look back at my own personal history with all this stuff, because I had seen, when just keep in mind, I'd had a pretty extensive experience with other experiments in digital currency. A lot of people don't remember this, but there's digital cash and e-gold and all kinds of things that were happening, because once it became clear that the internet was um, something that was actually viable economically, the very next step was, well, we need a money for the internet. And so there were all these experiments out there, and they kept failing and failing and failing. And then the people behind them turned out to be shady characters, or their software wouldn't work, or the systems, actually what usually happens is that their systems got hacked, and all kind of, spam emails were being sent out, and then people were clicking on them, and phishing attempts, and people were losing their money. And so, it was just a disaster, because well, let me just say that I kind of wrote it off. I thought, well, I've seen this fail too often. And so when Bitcoin came out, actually, and I got my first kind of notice about this in the fall of 2010, I got my first like official communication, although I had heard rumblings about it. I just kind of lumped it in with every previous failure. And this is a mistake, because I didn't understand that the failure of DigiCash and eGold and the rest of these attempts to come up with a brand new currency that was priced according to a market that was independent of fiat currency, I didn't understand that they had failed for particular reasons. It wasn't that as a class it was not possible to create new money. New money. I thought that um, I didn't understand the particulars for why. Although I knew there was hacking involved and stuff like that, but it didn't occur to me to think, well, that failure is a sign that something needs to be tweaked. That's a technical fix. And I couldn't imagine it. And I had decided that it was not possible to create a new money. Now, that sounds like an extreme conclusion, but it's actually not an extreme conclusion when you consider there's a certain theoretical impetus behind it. There's this theory that had been floated around for about the last century that had been that's generally attributed to Ludwig von Mises, called the regression theorem. And the idea is that a money has to originate in barter exchange, like a commodity that you use in barter. And then that gradually becomes ever more valuable, and people acquire it not for consumption purposes, but to trade at a later date. And then that becomes the money. And then once you have a good that functions as a medium of exchange and a store of value, then there's a network effect that kicks in that makes it the money, and then no other future money is necessary. And then and no matter how bad that money gets, whether it's subject to central bank manipulation or inflation, or it's got all kind of third-party problems, or there's counterparty risk in the payment systems associated with it. No matter how bad it ever gets, there's absolutely no hope for replacing that money with a new money, unless and to the extent that this new money emerges again out of a barter exchange, which that can't happen because we're in too advanced economic structures for any commodity to ever, organically emerge the way the early currencies did in, say, the High Middle Ages. So that was my thinking, and from which I concluded that the only hope for any monetary reform was to somehow change the dollar from being a fiat currency into a sound money that it once was. The problem with that is that will never happen because the guardians of the system like the system exactly as it is. So I became a kind of I guess you would say, like a hopeless nihilist on the monetary question. Like, I didn't think there was any chance for any change. And the failures of these pre-Bitcoin digital currencies just further reinforced what you could say is like a deep bias that was rooted in a kind of a high-level theory that I thought it was ridiculous. So by the time Bitcoin came along, I thought, nope, that's dumb. This is silly. People far less smart than I am are far less smart than I are wasting their time on this silly little jazzy code slinging, whereas they don't understand. If they had sophisticated monetary education and views like I have, they would realize that this is just completely ridiculous. So I figure it was either bogus or possibly a scam, or just headed towards disaster or something. And a lot of the problem came down to the fact that I didn't really understand the architecture. And the reason I didn't understand the architecture is that I had been educated in economics, but not in things like, the distributed networks and why those matter, or cryptography, or hashing systems and how those work, or any of the protections that have been built in to prevent double spending. And I didn't understand one really critical thing, which was that this money wasn't a conventional money, that it wasn't just a means of payment, and it wasn't just a mere medium of exchange or a store of value, or you could name all these other functions that money does, but that it rolls into the monetary unit its own sort of built-in, as it were, payment system, and that was its critical innovation. That it takes, what Visa, MasterCard do for the dollar and clumps it all into a single technology and says, okay, here's your money, and the payment system is part of that. And if I had understood that, I would have, and if I had spent a little bit of time understanding distributed networks and cryptography and hashing, and how uh, the Bitcoin economy kind of reproduces certain features of the physical world within the digital world. If I had understood that, then I would have been all in. But it took me, a couple of years really to finally incentivize myself to sit down and try to figure this out and understand it. And then after that happened, and by the way, that only happened once. I had had real world experience with owning and transferring Bitcoin, and that's what that experience of using it actually got me super curious intellectually. Now I had to unravel, sort of a lifetime of understanding of money and rebuild it on a new basis. And that took me better part of 6 months, during which time I had, or even up to a year, but during which time I was already writing articles about the topic. Yes. And so it was based on my experience, not so much knowledge, but just experience. And I've never felt so much pressure in my life to repudiate my writings. I felt like I was trolled from one end of the internet to the other. Um, it was a scary time because at no point in the course of this was I absolutely confident that I had latched onto something that actually could work or that does matter. I just had a good intuition that I did, but I couldn't know for sure. So it was consuming because I felt like maybe I was surrendering a lifetime of credibility to back, something that might turn out to be completely ridiculous. So I got myself very much invested in um, the markets for Bitcoin. And even though I was never the guy who said, "Look, this is only works if and to the extent that it's constantly rising in value," like I was never that guy. But you sort of can't help it. Once your credibility is on the line, you sort of become a cheerleader for ever increasing prices, as if that's the test of whether or not the technology is real or not. And it's not. But you know, we all we all feel that, we all get roped into it.
No, I completely agree. The episode I just did was about this last week that now it'll be actually 2 episodes ago that I just released, was about me not trusting my instincts, not trusting my gut and what I knew was true. And I had been mining, back in the day, and I gave it all up. I stopped mining just because I got busy and made a move and all that kind of stuff. But I look back at old wallets, and what if I would have held on to all that? It was the biggest financial mistake of my life, in terms of what could have been. And yes, it wasn't real money. It was the what could have beens, but it was a very expensive education. But an education and needing to understand better the ability to look at what really other really smart people in various fields are coming together and saying, putting all that information together, as long as with the what value your instinct and your gut has for you, and and trusting that when something is going to be something. But it's easy to look back and consider yourself myopic. But in reality, I don't think it is necessarily that short-sighted or crazy to really have an inkling of doubt about something that you're going, well, of course this is going to kick thousands of years of economic history and kind of trends and what we've come to understand as being possible. But when you think back to where you were kind of at that inflection point where you kind of realized what Bitcoin was and its potential, and that was what kind of going on 5-6 years ago. Where did you think that we would be by now? Not in terms of price, but kind of in terms of adoption, where it would be.
Oh, and adoption. Wow, I'm certain that I had higher hopes for it than have been realized in a way, probably. Um, but yeah, this is always a problem when the future is really clear to you. It's hard to factor time and learning into that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, like if you know for sure that in the future, well, so here's the thing. I came to the realization that all existing uh, fiat monies and payment systems were ridiculously old-fashioned by comparison to cryptocurrency. And it would be like if everybody was driving around on a Model T and then you just showed up in a Maserati and drove around town for a while. You'd think that everybody and you had them available for people. You'd think that everybody would just like abandon their cars and drive around the Maserati. And that's sort of the way I looked at it. It's not that I thought that everybody was going to happen overnight or seamlessly or without all kinds of friction from regulators and that sort of thing. But I thought that if the world was a kind of a perfect place, that it would immediately adopt the superior technology and or at least at some point, adopt superior technology and abandon the inferior one. But the first sign. Now, when I was thinking this, you have to remember this is in early 2013 when there weren't really any regulatory barriers around. Like this is hard for anybody to remember, but from the time of the invention of Bitcoin up until early 2013, at least in the United States, anyone could start their own crypto dollar exchange. Like there were absolutely no regulatory barriers at all. And there were a ton, like thousands of people were starting these exchanges. It was a pure free market. And then I think it was in April of 2013, there was the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the U.S. Department of Treasury sent out a fax of all things to a bunch of different exchanges that were then operating. Um, I'm not sure they even sent emails, but they'd sent some kind of communique, and it was really like a one-page thing that said, "Look, if you're exchanging Bitcoin for dollars, you've got to register as a money exchange. Period. That's it." And what that means is that you have to register in every state. And back in those days, there was a minimum expense of, I don't know, like $250,000 or something like that. So suddenly compliance became this huge issue and everybody dropped out of the industry. And so there were a few legacy companies that were operating like Coinbase and BitPay and some others, and they had the kind of wherewithal to undertake these compliance costs, and they kind of survived. But everybody else was wiped out. I had just a ton of friends who had all kinds of ingenious ideas for the things they were going to do with this industry, and they were just kind of wiped out. And that was the first sign that I thought, we are not going to get from here to there so easily. It's going to take a lot more because and that was a draconian intervention. These are back in the days when people look back and they think of that was the Wild West. It wasn't. I mean, we had already seen the crackdown, coming. And then I realized we've got a problem with the on ramps and the off ramps with crypto, getting in and getting out. And then the banks started hammering crypto companies and started uh, uh, deleting people's accounts and making some very strict distinction between businesses that accept crypto and individuals, and it just got tighter and tighter and tighter. And then the companies that are out there, the existing exchanges and things, were having to spend more and more and more money on compliance, and then suddenly the lawyers got involved, and it just became an immense problem. And it was an interesting thing for me because I just, like I'm a little bit of a dreamer, I think, like a lot of us in this space. And we know what could happen if we had, a competitive environment that was free of regulatory intervention. Um, but we hadn't really entirely thought through the friction, the static, and the difficulties and the diversions of resources that would take place under a regulatory framework. And it became a serious problem because the regulators themselves didn't really understand what Bitcoin was. So they kept trying to make it act like it was cash or just a dollar economy or just another stock or something. They still to this day don't really know what it is. So it's kind of a problem. But these know your customer laws, for example, they ran headlong into the problem that Bitcoin was structured to be a trustless system. So you had an old style regulatory framework being trying to slapped onto this currency that was built to be resistant to all this old stuff, for structurally resistant to it, not because it was trying to sneak around the law, but because it was actually superior to the thing that was previously regulated by these old regulatory laws. So that set us back years and years and years, and that was a terrible diversion. It still is. I think our user interfaces would be much better now if we had. Uh, I mean, we would just be further along now if we had had a genuine competitive environment and not so many regulatory diversions and resources wasted on compliance rather than innovation. I think it would be further along. And then, if you let me, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm on a long monologue here, but there was this. And then I hate to be the guy to raise this topic, but I don't think people talk about it enough. But in the early days, Satoshi, when he was still communicating, had warned against too broad and a push for acceptance before the thing was really ready for prime time. Like, he wasn't convinced it was scalable yet. And part of the problem was the limit on the block size, and there were other factors, besides. But it was one of the tragedies of the last 10 years. I think probably the single greatest tragedy, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me on this, but I personally, from a user point of view, found it overwhelming that everybody knew the scaling problem was coming, and there just wasn't much of a passionate desire to fix it. At least there was on the part of some people, but there were too many people that were just still kind of, it's extremely conservative in outlook. Like, my God, this thing is only around. It's only been around 5-6 years. 7 years now. We're still in the infancy. Let's not change anything about its structure. Let's just be super glad that the thing works at all and not prepare it for any kind of mainstream use. But already the use case was presenting itself in terms of remittances, and people were really getting on board. And then, of course, the disastrous year everybody thinks is the great year of 2017, but actually it was a catastrophic year in terms of usability of Bitcoin. And my old friend Bitcoin, which was fast and cheap, just seemingly overnight. I know it was a kind of a gradual process, but it, like, at least for me personally, became something completely different, and it became basically less efficient, um, and more expensive to use than old style monetary systems. And that was something I never expected would happen. I mean, and it was my fault because the scaling debate had gone on for a long time, but I was involved in all kinds of other things. I just didn't see it coming. So when I saw it, I was just in shock and a little bit embarrassed, because I look back at all of my old writings, and all the selling points I had given Bitcoin turned out to not really be selling points anymore. So we all know what happened, with the first big fork that took place with Bitcoin Cash, and I supported that mainly because, not because I wanted a fork, but because I wanted something usable, and maybe on chain scaling wasn't, it's not a very good long term fix. I don't really know, but it seemed to be. The use case is an important thing. And at the time, I heard all these people talking about, oh, well, the most important thing is we preserve the store of value function of Bitcoin, not the medium of exchange function. It's not meant to be cash for the internet. Well, clearly, it was intended to be cash for the internet. But there's a more important theoretical concern that the store of value function is not sustainable if you don't have the use case in place. And this traces back to a deeper question of monetary theory and its origins. And so we got this kind of the developer community really did drive a wedge between these two things, the store of value and the medium of exchange. And that really kind of broke my heart because it did structurally change Bitcoin. And then we saw the massive decentralization of alternative cryptos come into place, and the seeming chaos. I mean, maybe it would have happened anyway, and I think it's okay. And I'm not saying this is all wholly regrettable and so on, but it's just a fact of history that Bitcoin was not ready for prime time when the world needed it most. And I think that did set us back a long time.
I I think that there's something in there where you say that not ready for prime time, and that I think that Bitcoin was maybe exposed a little too early. I mean, somewhat with the Silk Road, but especially with WikiLeaks. And Satoshi even talked about that the hornet's nest had gotten stirred and that it was about to descend upon us. And I kind of think, I do, just kind of a thought experiments with that I've been thinking about. What if Bitcoin had not been exposed so early with the Silk Road, but especially with WikiLeaks? What if people had not really heard about it mainstream? Where would it be today if it had not kind of burst onto the scene in such a prominent fashion? Because it kind of went from being a niche experiment in a very small community, kind of to burst onto the front page news, or page 2 or 3 or 4 of the average reader in the country, and more importantly, onto the forefront of regulators and law enforcement and lawmakers. And if I wonder that if that had never happened, that maybe the scale of development, or I should say the pressure to grow, would have been subsided, and a lot of these issues maybe would have gotten had more time for development, and that bull run, that first initial one, maybe didn't happen in 2013, 2014. Maybe that did not actually occur till 15, 16, 17.
That's interesting. I don't, that is a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about, and it's funny because I'm glad you're recalling all this because it's making my mind race back. In early 2013, when I started looking into it, was one of the biggest frustrations I had was that I couldn't find material even available that was accessible to the average person, even the average smart person. I mean, it was all just extremely difficult. Like, like now I read the white paper and it just like every bit of it makes perfect sense to me. I love reading the white paper and I redo it. I read it over and over again. Like all of us. But when I first read it, I thought, well, this is just I can't understand a word of this because I wasn't schooled enough in the technology really to understand it. So what I did, uh, because I was frustrated that well, what it told me was that most of the people involved in the industry were just computer programmers, and I really wanted economists, philosophers, historians, um, just prophets of the digital age generally, whatever, to get together and evaluate and explain the technology to me. And I couldn't find any conferences that were going on that did this. I know there was, I guess, the Bitcoin Foundation had run up to that time one national conference, and I think they had maybe prepared a second one. But I just, out of my own like desperate burning curiosity, decided to organize my own conference, and um, that was sometime in maybe March or April, and I scheduled it for October, I believe, of 2013 in Atlanta, and paid for it myself, and got a few sponsors uh, to reduce the costs. It didn't make a dime, and I even arranged for the travel for a lot of speakers, which people don't do now, because it was mostly intellectuals, and it never even occurred to me at the time that I would just create a pay to play conference. Like I didn't even know that was possible or desirable. So I just had entirely intellectuals speaking there. And it's called the Cryptocurrency Conference, held in Atlanta, the first week of October, I believe, in Atlanta. And I was thrilled that like I had 250 people sign up for it, which was amazing for the first time out. And like I say, this was before Bitcoin conferences became a thing. So the day before the conference opened, I'm welcoming guests and they're trying to find their hotels, and I'm just nervous and I'm trying to print programs and set up the chairs and talking to the catering and all the rest of it. Suddenly the news comes out that Ross Ulbricht had been arrested. That was the day before the conference. And it was all over the news. And here's this drug kingpin, and he uses this weird thing called Bitcoin. And wow, I remember introducing the conference the next day. And of course, we were all, I don't know if what you were doing, but I was desperately looking at the price, because the explanation for the price in those days was not that this is a great technology, not that it has this great future, that, oh my God, here we have for the first time in 6,000 years, a currency that's completely independent of government and is censorship resistant, and could actually provide a private alternative, which is all the reasons I was interested in it. A lot of other people just explained the value of Bitcoin, that it was useful for illegal activity, and in particular, um, buying and selling drugs on this thing called the Silk Road. So people figured that if the Silk Road was taken down and the alleged Dread Pirate Roberts guy was arrested, that would cause the magic internet money to plummet in price, which I don't remember what the price was, but am I right in thinking it was something like $130 or something like that? I don't really remember. But I watched the price, with great curiosity to see what would happen. And it dipped for like a few minutes, and then 24 hours later, it was actually higher than it was before. And I think that should have at that moment been proof of concept. Like, this was the main explanation for Bitcoin's value at the time. Well, it's because everybody's using it on the Silk Road. Well, that arrest and the shutting down of that website had really no negligible impact whatsoever on the price, as I recall. And I think I pointed that out actually in my opening remarks at the conference, that there's clearly something else going on here besides that. And if it had been that, it still would have been interesting. It would have been notable and fascinating, just proof of concept kind of stuff. But apparently, looking at the empirical reality, there was a lot more going on here than just that. And that should have been enough. But of course, one thing you learn after being in the sector for 10 years is that no amount of empirical reality will make any difference to the permanently incredulous mind.
I just pulled up a Guardian article from that time, and it said that it dipped down from 145 down to 109, and then recovered later that day about 124. That it was down from a record high of $266. So it's probably a good thing that nobody actually bought at that time, right? You wouldn't have wanted to buy the top at 266.
Okay, so yeah, I'm glad. Thanks for correcting my, yeah, right. Yeah, I knew it was something along those lines, but I think like within a couple of days anyway, it was back to where it was, right before the arrest. So it just didn't. I mean, there was a little bit of a psychological swing, but it wasn't a fundamental swing. And so therefore, the mainstream theory for why anybody cared about Bitcoin at all was exploded like overnight. But it just made no difference whatsoever. And I remember this very well, because I remember in the summer of 2013, I was giving a talk in Vancouver at a financial conference, and I was talking about this, and like people were not talking about this technology at all at any kind of mainstream investor event. So anybody who breathed the word Bitcoin in those days in the summer of 2013 was automatically written off as a crazy and a crank, right? So, but I did it anyway. And then I was surrounded by people afterwards, and this very sharp woman who came up to me, and she said, listen, I have a theory, and I want you to confirm it. Is this the thing that everybody's using in the illegal dark web drug markets? I said, yes, it is. She goes, aha, that's the reason for the value. Thank you very much. I understand it now. And she walked off. And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, you think you understand, but you really don't understand, do you?
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that was the terrorism thing. That was the kind of the trope of around the 2013 time period, right? That was the attack vector at the time, that Bitcoin's only used for dark markets and for funding terrorists. And for a while that kind of disappeared. I mean, it was always kind of in the background. It was always kind of hiding back there, but it kind of disappeared. It was not as in the forefront as it was at that time. Um, and it's not that it's gonna have gone away forever, because I mean we're really only one event away where there's some sort of incident and one of the suspects has some sort of hot wallet app with $3 in Bitcoin in it, from that kind of being another attack vector again. But um, going back to the fork, this all kind of depends on exactly which side of the scaling debate you're on. But no matter which side you talk to, they will both agree that Bitcoin did suffer an attack in 2017. And both sides will say that they thwarted an attack. And one side would say that the attack was to keep block sizes unnecessarily small and raise up fees. Another one would say that they stopped an attack on Bitcoin to increase the block sizes.
And therefore centralized mining and so on and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah. So both sides definitely did see 2017 as an attack and a victory, right, for their sides. And I guess it remains to be seen which one the market ultimately chooses. Although both sides will say that they are winning and will eventually win. But where do you see the greatest attack vector for Bitcoin in the coming 10 years?
Well, it's definitely going to be compliance issues and know your customer laws and issues concerning uh, treating Bitcoin like a personal bank, private Swiss bank, and this sort of thing. So it's going to be money laundering, probably tax evasion, just non compliance stuff, and it's going to be enormously um, frustrating, really. I think for everybody, and just to see the regulatory noose, tightened and tightened and tightened. But and I think so long as normal economic conditions prevail, this is going to be the way things are, and we don't see a big uptick in adoption. This will continue to happen. However, and this is kind of the great unknown. At some point, we're going to experience something like 2008 all over again. It's not going to be exactly like that. It'll be a different sector. It'll have a different trigger. It'll have different effects. But this time, the Fed has virtually no flexibility to move like it did in 2008 to increase reserves the way it did for the banking sector in those days, because its flexibility is basically gone. Especially now that the Fed has stopped raising rates anymore, and its balance sheets, it's had to interrupt its progress towards patching up its balance sheet. So it just doesn't have the flexibility it had in 2008. So you could make an argument that the next financial crisis is going to be worse, and it's definitely coming. Whether it comes in 1 year or in 5 years or in 8 years, I don't know. But that would be, in that period of time, and suddenly the merit of Bitcoin is going to be readily apparent, all over again. And we're going to see, a level of adoption. I don't care how much the masters of the universe think they can control the system. They can't control the system once people start seeing Bitcoin as sound money that is untouchable and usable and safe and a how do you say safe haven, for people's wealth. At that point, there's not going to be any turning back.
And that's interesting, because when I look back, I kind of basically see kind of three waves of adoption, three themes in those waves of adoption. The first was the tech adoption theme, and you see this in kind of the early developers, right? So the Hal Finneys, Gavin, a lot of those early adopters that were really tech savvy people who understood the language of Bitcoin. And the next wave was kind of more the political theme. And this was most notably, people like yourself in the liberty movement, especially, who came to be kind of the evangelizers, um, and spread the message of Bitcoin through the political adoption theme. And then we saw the speculator adoption theme play out. This was in 2014, and then we kind of saw another wave to that. And the speculative adoption theme, I think, is still going to play out in smaller and smaller waves. But you think that this will actually be the next wave of adoption? This safe haven, people running away from the crashing of fiat markets.
Sure. Sure, and I think it's very important to recognize that the price patterns of safe haven assets after 2008 defied every expectation from everybody, because there's always a safe haven. There's always a go-to place to get away from the mainstream financial system, which is proven to be so incredibly unstable and unreliable over the many decades of its progressive destruction. And so there's always been an alternative, and that's usually always been precious metals. After 2008, that was not true. It completely changed, and the great benefit of that sort of safe haven psychology flowed to crypto. Even though crypto is not that well known, it's still, for the smart money, that became the safe haven asset. And I think it's extremely important. I've heard very little talk about this because gold, what gold was, has for thousands of years been the go-to thing for that you would run to in the event of failing fiat currencies, and it's still a hugely valued asset, all over the world. I mean, China banks can't seem to get enough of it, and it's still this really important thing. But the question is whether or not there's any real upward potential to the price in the event of a mass, not just bank demand, but mass demand. And I'm not sure that the evidence is really there that uh, has much of a future. And if that's true, that's a dramatic change from the past.
We talked briefly at the beginning about your book, Right Wing Collectivism, and in that book, you talk about the rise of the Hegelian right and left, and I think that those themes are obviously emerging now, but that they will become more and more dominant in the future as we move forward. So I was wondering if you could explain what those terms mean, and how is it going to affect the future political climate that Bitcoin will be operating in.
Sure. Well, and anybody who reads the papers knows that there's this, endless, ongoing, incredibly tedious struggle between the left and the right. And you probably have everybody has their favorite team. It's like the Super Bowl or something. and and there's a perception that one team has to win, and it can only happen, or the victory can only happen from crushing the other side. But what people don't really recognize is that really there's so much in common between these two competitive forces. They're both authoritarians with different social and cultural, there's different social and economic priorities and different cultural pitches, and they're uniquely structured to manipulate highly politicized societies. I think most people actually are not involved in this ridiculous struggle, but the newspapers can't stop reporting on it, and it's getting more intense, every day. And you can see it on one hand with the New Zealand shooter the other day, proclaiming his fealty to the Führer and to a right Hegelian historicist, hard racist framework of homogeneous society and the meritorious use of violence to wipe out the opposition. That's on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the very weird rise of socialism in the United States, where you have wacky things like the Green New Deal being reported as normal news, where here's a program being asserted by certain very fashionable people within a single political party that is imagining that we need to abolish internal combustion within the next 10 years and end plane travel, overseas and replace everything with wind power, which is the biggest, craziest fantasy you can ever imagine. I mean, so you have two fantastic versions of political reality being presented to us. I mean, one, a perfectly homogeneous society ruled by an authoritarian dictatorship and central planning for revanchist and restorative reactionary purposes. And on the other hand, this kind of complete fantasy of a socialist primitivism being administered by, highly educated ideologues on the left. So, and it's very dangerous, this civil war that's taking place between the two, because everybody else is going to get caught between them. And like say, everybody has their favorite side in the struggle, but they fuel each other. One side says, "Oh, look, if we don't rally around our guy, then this guy is going to win." And the other side says, "Oh, look how terrible that guy is. We better rally around our guy, or that guy is going to win." And it's all just a kind of a struggle for control, and neither one are favoring what I favor, which is just a normal society where people are left alone to conduct their lives and innovate and live at peace with their neighbors. I mean, that's what I think the vast majority of humanity wants. But we've built these gigantic these states around us, and there's the competition to control them has become ever more intense and very bitter. And I'm hoping that in my lifetime we see people recognize the error of their ways and go back to a kind of a normal bourgeois belle epoque of peace and prosperity. But to my shock, it's not getting better. It actually seems to be getting worse.
It's kind of interesting because we see that within Bitcoin. On Twitter, there's a thread with involving Peter McCormack of the What Bitcoin Did podcast, and we're kind of talking about I can't remember the exact genesis of it, but by the time that I kind of jumped in, they were talking about the different ideologies within Bitcoin and within any culture or social movement, whatever. I don't know if you necessarily agree with this, but there's always kind of the liberal and conservative wings, and they need each other to an extent. The conservatives make sure that things don't get. I don't want to misuse the term anarchic, or I guess chaotic is a better term. Without the conservatives, things can get very chaotic if the liberal wing switches too far to that side. And if there's too much power in the conservative wing, things can get stagnant and no longer grow, no longer be vibrant. The problem being that with these pendulum swings from liberal to conservative is that whenever they swing too far, it's not even the actual reactions of it being too conservative, too liberal, but also the counter reactions from the other side that can also cause basically full on chaos to erupt.
Yeah, and what you call liberalism and conservatism actually gets squeezed out, right? By two forms of extremists, left extremists and right extremists. And it's actually really interesting because, like, old fashioned, what you call liberalism, and I prefer the old definition of liberalism, the 19th century. But let's say use a 1980s or 90s, like a 1990s definition of liberalism, which was like good government, a certain amount of frugality, with an emphasis on maybe fairness and access and equal opportunity, like that. I mean, that seems to be like, it's not even around anymore, really. I mean, like a responsible, sane, liberal style person from the 1990s is now shouted down by the extremists on the left. And then you have, I'm sorry, my
Don't worry
mechanical
about it.
clock here, by the way, it's not being operated by quartz technology, much less blockchain. Um, but then then you have the extremists on the right are freezing out the sort of 80s and 90s style conservatism that I was raised with, and which is it hardly even exists anymore. I mean, like just for example, this protectionism thing. I mean, it's just amazing. We had a consensus, basically, in this country for that free trade was good and that peace was good and that we should have as much trade as possible and that we should expand the division of labor because that's like a guarantor of peace. And like hardly anybody even questioned that. And there are a few efforts at like, oh, don't dump your products on us, and oh, we're going to protect this industry against unfair foreign competition. But it wasn't a systematic, all-embracing ideology. But that has completely changed. And the same thing is true about immigration. I mean, you can go back to the 1980s and see debates between candidates Bush and Reagan. It was 1980. Yeah, would have been, I guess, about 1980, right? Or maybe it was the 84 race. I don't know. I think Reagan was unchallenged in 84, so it would have been 80. And they're trying to outdo each other on who favors free immigration more. So who is more pro-immigrant? This is within the Republican Party. So things have dramatically changed, and the extremes have really taken over. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's funny because when I was in graduate school, we used to talk about the median voter theorem and how ultimately there was a kind of a logic in politics, but everybody would gravitate towards the middle and nobody could ever change that. So no extreme would ever happen. And that's both good and bad. It means that on one hand, you're protected against fanatics on the left and right. On the other hand, the bad part is that you can't actually make any big fundamental changes in the system. But for whatever reason, the median voter theorem is just doesn't seem to be holding up anymore. and so and so that sort of sane middle, is being vanquished from our political systems for reasons that are completely unjustified, as far as I can tell, because we've never been more prosperous than we are right now. I mean, it's not like we're living in Weimar Germany or the Great Depression. You know, those are the old excuses we used to have for why dictatorship comes to power. You know, but now, we're all carrying around supercomputers in our pocket, and the crime rates, falling. There's the infant mortality is almost non-existent, and so on and so on. And all we can do is complain and demand a dictator. So we're weird people, weird times.
No, it's amazing because I was just looking at a tweet today, and the individual was she's a Time, she writes for Time magazine. She has a book deal, and some other stuff I think for television, and she was retweeting a tweet by this same politician that you're talking about who's very fashionable at the moment, and I can't remember the gist of it, but she was saying basically that herself and this congresswoman had never experienced prosperity in their lives, and it just kind of blew me away. And it's just there's no appreciation. I mean, it's you're talking, this person, like I said, has all these things going for them, and you're literally using as kind of your uh, uh, counterpart, somebody who's just a recently elected congressperson, and I'm just wondering, I don't know about what prosperity what they consider it, but I'm and a lot of people, of course, there's always outliers, but the vast majority of people in this country don't have that level of prosperity. So I don't understand this total lack of appreciation, as well as for this feeling as though they are, in some bottom rung of society that needs saving, and just society in general. I don't know the exact ages, but we're talking about people that have roughly been in this country for the last 30 years or so, and just over the last 50 years, I mean, the quality of life and what you could expect from living in this country is just so much better now than when our parents were growing up. When people who were at the same age 30 years ago we're significantly better off with what we have access to, and I don't want to be. I'm not one of those people that blames internet and social media for all our ills, and I'm not some sort of luddite in that sense. But it seems like with kind of this new world of the social media, the louder voices, the squeakier wheel gets the grease, and those voices get amplified, while those with a more thoughtful approach do not. And people tend to gravitate towards extremes in my limited experience, and a lot of people who may be, in this case on the left, may go, well, I don't really agree with everything that they say, but as far as for the loud voices out there, that's the loud voice that most closely aligns, and I'm going to support this person because they're my loud voice versus the other person's loud voice.
Well, I think everything you said is valid, and it also reflects a rising ethos, which I would summarize as being the internet is evil. I mean, this seems to be, a growing sense, and I think it just simply comes down to the fact that we're going through terrible growing pains in social media. Most of the platforms that were, put in place 10 years ago were built on the presumption that people are good, that order can spontaneously emerge out of chaos, that everybody has a well-intentioned and earnest desire to communicate and get their voices out there. We're going to build technologies that allow that to happen. Period. That's it. Let's go. Off to the races. Boom. And then we build algorithmic systems so that we feed you information based on your interests and so on. And very few people really thought through all the ways in which this could actually go wrong. And then years went by, and YouTube became a kind of a university for schooling people in extremist ideologies. It's like Nazi university and communist university. I mean, it's unbelievable the way these platforms have been used. And I don't think it was anybody's intention. But once ideology gets a hold of the human brain, it's like a brain cancer. It causes people to think and do crazy things that are just completely contrary to morality, and we're starting to see this take place. And I'm very sympathetic with the administrators of these platforms, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. And I know that it's all fun to hate on these people now, but you know, anybody who's ever tried to manage so much as a subreddit or an internet forum in the old days knows that there's going to be 3% of their users out there that are going to attempt to ruin it for everybody else. And you have to be ruthless and excluding them. And identifying them, excluding them, and I was involved in moderating some of those early internet forums, and I got real cynical real fast, and I just began to trust my nose and just go, up, you're gone, you're gone, you're gone. Now that's with 300 people, 500 people. You want to start something that potentially involves 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, 1 billion. I mean, this is just it's unmanageable by any kind of artificial intelligence, much less employees sitting around trying to take down posts as they appear. It's just completely unmanageable, and I don't think people anticipated that. And now we've got this kind of panic that's taken place. Like, oh my God, what have we done? What have we done? Our privacy is gone. We're raising a whole generation of wackos. We've created systems that put a premium on reach over quality, and so that makes the most outlandish and far-flung claims super attractive, like ideological porn, to the average casual user. And we've incentivized and built systems that we're not that are actually feeding the worst angels of our nature. And this has actually happened. And I'm, the fix is not obvious. I mean, you could just look at something like Facebook Live video. Okay, so when that came along, and it wasn't too many years ago, it was an amazing thing to realize that in my pocket, I have the ability to reach 1 billion people just with a couple of buttons I can press. And then I've got a live audience, and everybody's going to be watching me. I mean, that's an unbelievably impressive and astounding thing to happen. I grew up watching the Jetsons. I never imagined a world in which everybody would have their own built-in global television set in their pocket. I mean, just an inconceivable power, and it sounds like the greatest thing that ever happened. But what they never imagined is that certain thrill seekers and mass murderers would also find this technology useful too. And again, I'm not even proposing that I know the fix, But one thing I'm confident of is if we keep the regulators out of it, I think the people with the stake in the system and and the technologists will are more likely to figure out how to fix and improve these technologies rather than public authority. So I think we should work very hard to keep them unregulated, because I think even though we don't know the fix, I think the fix is going to emerge. And I have no interest. I mean, at this point, saying this is like weirdly radical, but I'm not giving up on the information age. Not yet.
No, no, not at all. I think it's, like you were talking about, that it is strange, that the conservative 20 years ago compared to now is a completely different beast. And I am absolutely blown away by this strange movement by conservatives to basically implement a right wing fairness doctrine on social media. And I guess I shouldn't be that surprised, but it still blows me away compared to, because I came from the conservative Republican camp. To see this now manifest is madness to me, compared to what I used to think that represented. Because it wasn't even, what, 10, 15, or I guess it's now going on 20 plus years now, because I believe it was during the Clinton administration when that was kind of more in vogue, but I may be wrong. But there was a move by those on the left to implement what's called the fairness doctrine, so that radio stations would have to play as many liberal voices as there were conservatives. Of course, that gets kind of weird to go like, well, how do you classify, and who is now the government going to say what's a liberal and conservative voice? But I do agree, though, with some of those voices that there is a bit of a unevenness in how rules are applied, and the fact that a lot of those rules aren't even necessarily published. But I don't think this Faustian bargain is a good fix. Market competition, to me, with a different platform is the only way to actually compete and fix this quote unquote issue that they have.
Yeah, all that's going to do is freeze the bad systems in place. And that's extremely important. Regulation of the existing technology is going to bake into our systems everything that's wrong with them and prohibit them from being fixed in the way that they potentially can be fixed. And people are working on fixes every single day, but you can't fix them if you're going to lock them down. Like Lego pieces that are frozen into place. They have to be unfrozen if you're going to be able to move them and improve the system. So this is a hugely important priority, and it's disgusting that both the left and the right are just gravitating more and more and more towards this idea of regulating the systems.
And I don't know if you are familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk. He's kind of a social media person. He kind of made his bones very early on in YouTube and other social platforms. But he's very dismissive of the concept that that social media is a bad thing. And his point has always been that what social media does is that it exposes us. It's not really something that changes us per se, but just exposes who we really are. Hey folks, I hope that you're enjoying this episode as much as we are. I don't have any sponsors, so if you could go over to supportmypodcast.com, you'll see all the different ways that you can support the podcast, from Amazon links to a bunch of other stuff. You could back us on Bitback or with crypto, but most of all, if you can go to iTunes and leave a 5-star and a written review, it'd be very, very helpful. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the show.
I think that's probably right. I think there's probably tweaks that could be made in algorithms to not cause us to be progressively worse than we actually are. And I think that has become a problem. Like the internet rabbit holes, like where we're just mindlessly fed ever more insane things, as we're browsing YouTube or Twitter or something. That's probably worth a fix. And I don't know what that looks like entirely. I think it probably looks something like Google's algorithms, where Google recognized very early on that they had to have a credibility rating for its searches, and I'm not saying they deployed it perfectly, but at least there was some effort to weight search results based on some credibility factors, and it seems like social media never really got around to doing that. So I think that's probably what the fix is going to come down to. But I agree with you generally that I don't think human beings are not worse now than they've ever been. It's just that we actually are discovering this now, and I have to think that that's a good thing. Even if we're looking at horrible things, it's probably better to know than not to know. And I'm with John Stuart Mill on this question. I really do believe this. I'm an enlightened liberal of the old school. I really think that you can't fix a problem unless you know about it. And the information age as it stands now in 2019 has been very good at probably fortunately in showing us terrible things we didn't want to see. But that's the first step towards finding a fix.
Yeah, I agree. I think that sunlight, the old adage that sunlight is the best disinfectant fits well. And these people with these terrible ideals, I want to know who they are, and I think that them being exposed and out in the open is the best way to go about this, because censoring them is not going to do anything but send them to some other dark corner of the internet, where they are going to fester, and it doesn't actually solve anything. It is just it's a stopgap, and you think because you don't see it, it's not occurring,
Oh, and they love it and they feed off of it too. And I go back and forth and like on this.
and it creates a martyr mentality,
Oh,
right?
sure, 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 sure. And then once you get into the habit of believing that because something is inaccessible, that must make it true. I mean, once you take that step, there's no bottom really where you can go. And then yeah, at that point, all the censorship and all the attempts to keep you from knowing things just ends up completely backfiring. I agree with you. And I understand the people that after World War II wanted to ban Mein Kampf or something like that, but I don't think it's really or prohibit people from seeing that Hitler propaganda film from 1934, whatever it's called, Triumph of the Will. But I don't think in the long run it actually does any good. I don't think it keeps Nazism at bay. I think it's better that people know rather than not know.
And you see this in Germany,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, oh yeah,
I mean, in Germany, it's illegal to have war memorabilia or that book or uh, any website, anything that displays the symbolism, but it has not clamped it down. It's festered below the surface, unseen, and now
sure,
it's starting to explode again onto the national scene.
yeah, sure. It didn't work. That's exactly right. It didn't work. And whereas, like to me, like something like Mein Kampf, which is a dreadfully boring and stupid book, um, with a barely, but there's a genocidal impulse in that book, even if you don't, it's never stated outright. Um, I think it's important for people to know what's in that work. And Triumph of the Will is a brilliant propaganda film that actually shows you the ghastliness and horror of what the rise of totalitarianism really looks like from a point of view of political propaganda. And I think it's an extremely instructive film to watch. I mean, I find it just chilling beyond belief. And it's shocking to me that anybody would have ever censored it, because it actually serves as a really important warning for the future.
No, and kind of zoom back out onto Bitcoin. Right now I'm looking over at on my desk here, and I'm trying to put together this art piece. But anyways, part of it is a bunch of inflated world currencies. The $100 trillion Zimbabwe note. But one of the ones I'm looking at right now is a 100 million Reichsmark note from 1923 in Weimar, Germany. And what brought this up was I was having an online discussion with somebody, which is always very fruitful. And we were talking, or I was just saying, kind of the lack of necessity of war And of course, the low hanging fruit for someone to bring up is always World War II, just because of the stark contrast of villains that were present. But without the end of World War One, the armistice, and the punitive punitive actions taken on Germany that affected their economy so terribly that I don't think that there would have been the ability for someone, a failed artist, to rise up to that level of power, but that it's these destructive natures of inflated currencies that destroy economies and lead to people making rash decisions. And I know the caveat that this is kind of definitely down the road of the what if machine.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, it's hard to, as you say, to do conjectural history like that, but there's no question that when a currency fails, it undermines the society itself fails. And it's not just the economy, right? It's the whole society. It's the culture. It's people's sense of reality, hope in the future. Like it really promotes like a vicious nihilism that leads to dictatorship. And that's how Hitler's message resonated with people. It's like, look, your currency failed. You can't trust the system. The only thing you really trust is the race, and we better unite. Around our biology. That's what's permanent. That's what's real. It's not that you're fake, money making schemes that matter. It's your blood that's pumping through you. That's the real unchanging force. And it was a message that could only resonate in a society in which was prepared for it by the failure of the Reichsmark. Which was it was one of the worst hyperinflation of the 20th century, really, up until later, I guess, up to that point in history. And there's no doubt that the rise of Hitler was connected with that. And that was right in the heart of Europe, right? The most civilized country, blah, 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 blah. And what a catastrophe, So the cause of sound money is bound up with the cause of peace, prosperity, and the good life. That's the lesson I think we should take from the Weimar hyperinflation and its aftermath. That was the very first exposure I ever had to any kind of economic history. I read about Weimar inflation when I was 20 years old. It rocked my world, and I've spent the rest of my life thinking about it and trying to work towards some kind of solution so that nightmare will never visit the world again.
And the last question I'd like to ask you, I guess it's a two-part, or I guess technically three-part question, is uh, looking back over the last 10 years, what was your greatest joy and disappointment in that period? And what do you see, where do you see Bitcoin in the next 10 years?
Okay, so my greatest joy was to discover that Bitcoin is real and it works, and that I was not wrong when I risked my entire reputation and my professional career in an article in February of 2013, in which I celebrated this technology and what it was coming. So I turned out to be right about that, and that was very, very satisfying because I didn't know for sure that I was right. I had to trust my eyes over my instincts, or I should say, my eyes over my bad theory, and then slowly adapt my theory. And I took out from that experience a lesson in intellectual humility, really, that I hope I'll never forget. My greatest disappointment was, I think I mentioned to you earlier, that to discover by 2017 that this thing was really not ready for mass adoption, and not that I could have done better or would have done better. I understand that there's all kinds of opinions on this matter, but that was actually devastating to me because I don't know. I feel like well, let's just say I regret that. I just regret that. Again, not even saying that it could have been or should have been fixed, but that was a great sad thing for me. But here we are in 2019. I'm actually enormously pleased at the way the sector looks right now. I love the decentralization of and the complex production structures associated with crypto economics today. I just think it's brilliant that it's attracted and maintained so many top minds and earnest developers and innovative entrepreneurs, and I just think that's just tremendous. And I think that at the current pace of development, we're going to look back, I think, in 10 years and say, oh, um, the release of that white paper in 2008 was the beginning of a transformation. It was the beginning of something glorious. And we should have realized that life would never be the same. I mean, we realized this in 2000. By 2009, we looked back and saw that the dot-com bust was something of an illusion, and I think leading to really a transformation of the world economy. I think we're going to look back and see the bust of 2018 in crypto economics as preparing the way for transformation of money and payment systems and the documentation technology we generally have for keeping up with what's mine and what's thine. The blockchain technology, I think, is got enormous future, and I think the upshot of this technology is going to be a more peaceful and prosperous world. I feel very confident about that.
And Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on tonight. So how can people get a hold of you, and where can they find you?
Sure. Well, um, you can follow all my work, and I write, just kind of constantly over at the American Institute for Economic Research and at AIR.org, as an organization founded in 1933. Ironically, it's awesome for me because it was founded as a kind of a organized intellectual resistance against the American default that was arranged by FDR in 1933, which he stole everybody's gold, closed the banks, and devalued the currency. And the founder of my institute here, E.C. Harwood, said, nope, that's not very good economics, and we need somebody to represent an opposition force for rationality and liberalism, classical liberalism in the world. So I'm very pleased to be speaking to you from AIR right now, and I would be thrilled if our listeners would go over there, check it out, and subscribe to our thrice weekly email.
I will have all the information from this episode, including contact information, links, and everything like that, at didyouknowcrypto.com/29. That's didyouknowcrypto.com/29. And Jeffrey, once again, thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.